A quiet marine biology teacher from Anaheim once drew a small comic book about tide pools to teach kids about the ocean. That little comic book grew into one of the most successful cartoons in television history. SpongeBob SquarePants has been on the air for over 25 years, has aired more than 300 episodes, has produced 4 movies, a Broadway musical, and a brand worth billions. The world inside the show is built with more care than almost any other kids' cartoon ever made. A pineapple house, a stone head next door, a restaurant shaped like a fishing trap, a torn recipe, a war veteran with a daughter who is a whale, a tiny green copepod with a wife built out of an old calculator. But underneath the bright, cheerful surface, the show has been carrying something much darker since the very first episode. Pulled segments, banned episodes, a confirmed end-of-the-world origin, a scary fan story the show itself later winked back at. Tonight, we walk slowly through all of it. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The pilot that had another name to understand where SpongeBob began. It helps to go back to a show that was already ending. In the middle of the 1990s, a different cartoon was running on Nickelodeon called Rocko's Modern Life. It was strange and fast and a little bit grown up in its humor, and it had gathered around it a small group of artists and writers who liked working together. One of those people was a man named Steven Hillenburg. He had trained as a marine biologist before he ever worked in animation, and he had spent years thinking about the ocean, about the small creatures that live in tide pools, about the quiet drama of life underwater. When Rocko's Modern Life came to an end, Hillenburg did not simply move on to another job. He carried an idea with him, and that idea had been forming for a long time. The idea was a show about a sea sponge, not a soft, rounded, realistic sponge, but a square one, bright yellow, shaped like the kitchen sponge that most people would recognize. Hillenburg had drawn an early version of this character years before in a small educational comic about tide pools, a comic meant to teach children about the animals of the sea. The sponge in that comic was an ordinary natural sponge at first. Over time, the design changed and the square shape took over because the square shape was funnier and easier to remember. By the time Rocko ended, Hillenburg had a folder of drawings, a sense of the world he wanted to build, and the loyalty of several artists who believed in him. What came next is the part that most people never see. Before a cartoon becomes a real series, it usually has to prove itself. The people who run the network need to be convinced that the idea will work, that it can hold an audience, that it is worth the enormous cost of making animation week after week. The way a creator convinces them is by making a pilot. A pilot is a single test episode, often produced quietly and cheaply, designed to show what the full series might feel like. Many pilots are never broadcast. They exist only inside the studio, shown in a room to a small number of decision makers, and then they are filed away. Some are lost forever. Some sit in a vault for decades. And in the case of this particular show, the pilot became one of the most quietly debated pieces of lost media in all of cartoon history because of a single detail that almost no one outside the studio knew at the time. The detail was the name. The character that the world would come to know as SpongeBob SquarePants was not originally called SpongeBob at all. In the earliest version of the show, he was called SpongeBoy, and the series itself was going to be titled SpongeBoy Ahoy. That was the name on the early materials. That was the name the crew used. According to sources that have traced the show's history, the pilot was built around this name, and the character answered to it throughout. For anyone who grew up with the show, hearing that name now feels deeply strange, almost like hearing a familiar song played slightly out of tune. The shape is the same. The voice would have been the same, but the word at the center of everything was different. The reasons for the change is the kind of small, ordinary business problem that quietly shapes enormous things. The name SpongeBoy, it turned out, was already taken. There was a product, a cleaning product, a mop sold under a very similar name, and that name was protected. A cartoon character cannot share a trademark with a real product if the owner of that trademark object, and so the name could not be used for a national television series. The discovery of this conflict forced a change. Hillenburg and the team had to go back and rename their main character before the show could move forward. They kept the sponge. They kept the personality. They kept nearly everything. They changed the name to SpongeBob, and they chose SquarePants as a surname, partly because the network wanted the word sponge to stay clearly in the title, so children would understand what the character was. This is where the lost media begins. Because the pilot had already been made with the original name, there now existed a version of the show that the public would essentially never see in its true form. The renamed version went forward, was reworked into the episode that aired as the series premiere, and became the SpongeBob the world knows. The earlier version, the one with the original name and the original details, slipped into the strange territory of footage that exists but cannot easily be found. Footage that people knew was real but could not hold in their hands. For many years, the evidence of this original pilot was thin. There was no clean, complete, widely available copy of the cartoon in its first form. What survived, at least in public, were fragments. One of the most talked about fragments was a single rare screenshot. It showed the main character, the sponge, in what appeared to be the audition scene at the restaurant that would become the Krusty Krab, and on his chest he was wearing a name badge. The badge did not say SpongeBob. It said the original name. For collectors and fans who study the history of the show, that screenshot was treated almost like a holy object because it was direct visual proof that the earlier version was not a rumor. It was a thing that had been drawn, colored, and filmed. The badge made it undeniable. potential. There was also the matter of the opening sequence. The famous SpongeBob intro, the one with the painted pirate face and the singing children, and the question shouted out across a yellow background, did not exist in the earliest version. The original opening was different. It did not include the pirate. It did not include the now iconic song. Sources that have studied surviving footage describe an early opening sequence that feels rougher and quieter, an opening that belongs to a show still figuring out what it wanted to be. The pirate and the song came later, and they became so central to the experience of watching SpongeBob that it is hard to imagine the show without them. But for a brief window, the show did exist without them, and that window is part of what makes the original pilot feel like a ghost of the series that almost was. It is worth being careful and honest here because the history of this pilot is tangled, and not every claim about it is fully settled. There is a long-running question among people who study the show about whether there were truly two separate pilots or only one pilot that was later altered. The most reliable accounts, including statements traced back to people who actually worked on the show, point toward a simpler answer than the legends suggest. The version that most cast and crew members ever describe is the 1997 pilot, the one that became Help Wanted. Those who have read the detailed histories of the show, including long oral histories where the people who made it tell the story in their own words, report that a secret, separate, fully different, unaired pilot is never mentioned. The conclusion that careful researchers tend to reach is that there was one pilot made in 1997, and that the so-called original version is really that same pilot before the name change and a few small adjustments. The difference is real, but it is the difference between a draft and a final copy, not the difference between two entirely separate cartoons. Anything beyond that, any story of a hidden second pilot locked away in a vault, sits in the realm of speculation rather than confirmed fact, and it deserves to be treated that way. What is confirmed is that the pilot was screened before it was ever broadcast. Records of the show's early history point to a screening in the spring of 1998, held in Austin, Texas, well before the series officially premiered to a national audience. The official premiere did not come until the first day of May in 1999. That gap, the long stretch between the pilot being finished and the show reaching the public, is the kind of quiet pause where lost media is born. During that time, the pilot existed as an internal object, something shown to a room, something filed under a production code, something that belonged to the studio and not yet to the world. For a long stretch of years, the original version of the pilot stayed out of public reach. Then, slowly, pieces of it began to surface. In the middle of the 2010s, a copy of the pilot finally appeared online, shared by a member of the lost media community who had managed to get hold of it. There was, however, a catch that disappointed the people who had been searching. The copy that surfaced was not the true original with the old name intact. It was the already renamed version, the one where the character had become SpongeBob. In other words, the thing that finally appeared was the edited build very close to the aired premiere, rather than the pure first draft with the original name on the badge. It was still valuable. It still showed the small differences in the opening and the credits that set it apart from the broadcast version. But it was not quite the lost grail that some had hoped for, because the single most distinctive feature of the original, the name, had already been replaced in the copy that escaped into the open. A short time later, another piece of evidence emerged from an unexpected place. A studio had produced a video celebrating a major anniversary of its animation history, a kind of look back across decades of cartoons. Hidden inside that anniversary video, someone spotted a brief glimpse of the original pilot, a frame that had not been widely seen before. That video was later taken down, which is itself part of the pattern, but the glimpse had already been noticed and saved. A few years after that, an even clearer image of the original character with his original name badge came to light, sharper than the blurry screenshot that fans had passed around for years. Each of these finds was small. None of them handed over the complete original pilot in perfect quality, but together they slowly filled in the picture, like someone reassembling a torn photograph one fragment at a time. The copies that did circulate online did not stay in one place for long. This is a detail that matters, because it explains why the pilot remained difficult to see even after it had technically been found. The footage belonged to a major company, and that company holds the right to it. Every time a copy appeared on a public platform, it tended to be removed, sometimes within months, on the grounds that it was protected material being shared without permission. A version posted on one video site was pulled down. A version uploaded to a large public archive was pulled down as well. The footage would vanish from one place and quietly reappear in another, passed along through smaller and more obscure corners of the internet, always one step ahead of the takedown notices. This is the strange afterlife of a piece of media that is both famous and forbidden at the same time. Everyone knows it exists. Many people have seen pieces of it, and yet it never settles into a stable, easy, official home because the company that owns it has never chosen to release the original version on its own terms. The result is a small, persistent mystery wrapped around the very first appearance of one of the most beloved characters in television. The show that would go on to run for more than 2 decades, that would spin off into movies and a stage musical and a brand worth an enormous amount of money, began with a character who had a different name, a different opening, and a quiet life inside a studio before anyone outside knew he existed. The renaming was not dramatic. It was a sensible business decision made to avoid a conflict with a cleaning product, but that ordinary decision television created a permanent gap between the show as it was first imagined and the show as it was finally seen, and into that gap fell the original pilot, the original name, and the original opening, all of them surviving now only in fragments and rescued frames. There is something fitting about the fact that a show so obsessed with detail, a show that gave its tiny villain a wife built out of an old calculator, and gave its retired superhero a daughter who is a whale, would itself be hiding a small secret in its own origin. The care that went into building the world of Bikini Bottom is the same care that went into that first test episode, and that care is exactly why the differences between the versions feel so meaningful. A name badge that reads one word instead of another should be a trivial thing. In the history of this show, it became one of the most studied images in the entire lost media community, proof that even the brightest and most familiar cartoon in the world started its life under a name that almost no one alive remembers hearing out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So, the very first version of the show carried a different name and a quieter opening, surviving today only in rescued frames and a single famous badge. But the pilot held one more problem that had nothing to do with the character at all. A borrowed song would soon lock the entire first episode away for years, and that story is where we go next. Section 2. The song that locked away the first episode music in a cartoon is rarely thought of as a legal object, but that is exactly what it is. Every piece of music that plays under a scene belongs to someone. A composer wrote it, a performer recorded it, a company often owns the rights to use it, and those rights are divided into pieces, one for broadcast, one for home video, one for streaming, one for foreign market. When a show wants to use a song, it usually has to pay for each of those pieces separately, and if it fails to clear even one of them, the song can become a trap. The scene can air on television under one kind of agreement and then become impossible to release on a disc because the disc requires a different permission that was never obtained. This sounds like a dry matter of paperwork. In the case of SpongeBob, it became the reason the very first episode of the entire series quietly disappeared from official home releases for years. The episode in question is Help Wanted, the premiere, the same episode that grew out of the pilot discussed earlier. It is a short, simple story. SpongeBob wants a job at the Krusty Krab. He is turned away, then proves himself when a hungry swarm of anchovies floods the restaurant, and he manages to feed them all by cooking an impossible number of Krabby Patties at incredible speed. It is a bright, joyful, slightly chaotic introduction to the character, and at the center of its most memorable sequence is a song. The song is called Livin' in the Sunlight, Lovin' in the Moonlight. It is an old piece of music, far older than the show itself. It was written in 1930 by two songwriters, one who composed the music and one who wrote the word, and it was created for a film released that same year by a major Hollywood studio. The original version was performed by a famous French entertainer of the era, sung in the smooth, charming style of early sound film. For a while it lived the ordinary life of a popular song from its time, recorded by a few different artists, played, and then slowly forgotten by the wider public as the decades moved on. What pulled the song back out of the past was a single unusual performer. In the late 1960s, a man who performed under the name Tiny Tim recorded his own version of it. Tiny Tim was one of the strangest and most distinctive figures in American entertainment. He played the ukulele. He sang in a high, trembling falsetto that sounded like nothing else on the radio. He had a sincere, almost childlike sweetness to his stage presence, and he became briefly very famous. The kind of performer who appeared on television variety shows and became a household name for a moment in time. His cover of the old 1930s song appeared on his first album at the end of the 1960s, and that recording, with its fluttering voice and its bright ukulele, is the version that would eventually find its way into Help Wanted. There is a quiet sadness woven into the timing of all this. Tiny Tim died in late 1996 after collapsing during a live performance. He was 64 years old. By most accounts, the crew of SpongeBob were writing and building the pilot episode around the time of his passing, which means the recording they chose to use belonged to a man who had only recently died. The accounts of exactly how the song came to be in the episode are not entirely clean, and this is a place where it is worth being careful rather than confident. Sources that have traced the story describe the recording being used without authorization from the singer's estate, meaning the people who controlled his recordings after his death had not granted full permission for the way it was used. Whether that was an oversight, a misunderstanding, or simply the kind of thing that happens when a small pilot is made quickly and cheaply is not something the public record settles with certainty. What is clearer is the consequence, because the consequence is documented and large. The consequence was a dispute over the home video right to the cover. A song can be cleared for one use and not another, and the rights needed to broadcast a recording on television are not the same as the rights needed to sell that recording on a disc that people take home and keep forever. According to a person who worked on the show in its early years, the heart of the problem was money. The network did not want to pay the singer's estate for the home video rights to the song. Broadcasting the episode was one thing. Pressing it onto a DVD that would be sold to millions of households with the song still inside it would have required a separate and apparently expensive agreement, and that agreement was not made. So a strange thing happened. When the time came to release the early seasons of SpongeBob on home video, the very first episode of the series was left out. The premiere, the origin, the episode that introduced the character to the world, was missing from the first season collection. Fans who bought the box set expecting to own the show from its beginning found that the beginning was not there. The episode existed, it had aired, people had seen it on television, but because of the song buried inside it, it could not legally be placed on the disc, and so it was quietly removed from the official home release. This is the precise definition of partially lost media. The episode was never destroyed and never truly vanished, yet for a stretch of years it could not be obtained in the one format that most people use, to own and rewatch their favorite shows. The absence stretched across several different early home video releases. The episode was kept off the first season collection. It was kept off the smaller volume releases that came out around the same time. It was kept off the combined sets that bundled the first seasons together. Each time a new early collection appeared, the premiere was simply not included, and each time the reason was the same unresolved question of the song and its right. For a young series that was rapidly becoming one of the most popular cartoons in the world, it was an odd gap, a hole right at the start of the story that the company seemed unable or unwilling to fill. The resolution, when it finally came, arrived through a side door rather than the front. The episode was not added to a corrected version of the first season set. Instead, it appeared a few years later, in the middle of the 2000s, tucked into the home video release of a much later season as a bonus feature. Someone who wanted to own the first episode legally on disc had to buy the collection for the third season and find the premiere sitting there among the extras, almost like a hidden track on an album. It is a curious way to release the beginning of a series, attaching it to a season that came years afterward, and it tells the story of the song problem more clearly than any explanation could. The episode could not be sold as a normal part of the early collections, so it was slipped out quietly later, in a place no one would expect to find it, once whatever arrangement was needed had finally been worked out. Over time, the episode did become more widely available, appearing in various later compilations and larger box sets, and eventually the premiere was no longer the difficult, missing object it had once been. But for the people who collected the show in its earliest years, the memory of that gap stayed. It became one of the first lessons that fans of the show learned about how their favorite cartoon really worked behind the scenes. The bright surface of Bikini Bottom sat on top of a complicated machine of contracts and permissions, and a single old ukulele recording, chosen perhaps out of affection for a recently departed performer, had been powerful enough to keep the show's own birth out of stores for years. The international history of the song adds another layer to the story, because the same problem that affected home video also touched the episode in other countries. In at least one foreign version of the episode, the song does not play in full. The sequence that should be carried along by the bright ukulele cover is cut short, with the music dropping out and the episode skipping ahead. The reasons for these foreign edits are not always spelled out, and some of them likely come down to the same web of rights that caused the home video trouble, the difference between what could be cleared in one country and what could not be cleared in another. The effect, again, is a version of the episode that is slightly incomplete, a premiere that exists in more than one shape depending on where in the world a person happened to be watching. For many years, the simplest description of the situation was that the song was locked. The composition was old, but the specific recording and the rights attached to it belonged to people who had to be paid, and the company that made the show had decided at the start that it did not want to pay for every possible use. That decision rippled forward through home video releases, foreign broadcasts, and the memories of fans, and it turned a cheerful musical number into one of the most important pieces of legal history in the entire franchise. Then very recently, a part of that lock quietly opened. On the first day of 2026, the original 1930 musical composition entered the public domain under the copyright law of the United States. This is an important and specific thing, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than overstated. Copyright does not last forever. After a certain number of years, a work loses its protection and becomes free for anyone to use, perform, and copy. The song was written in 1930, and after the long stretch of decades that the law allows, the underlying composition, the melody, and the words as they were first created passed into the public domain at the start of 2026. That means the song itself as a piece of writing is now free in a way it was not before. It is worth being precise about what this does and does not change, because the distinction matters, and the public record support being careful here. The composition entering the public domain is not the same as every recording of that composition becoming free. A specific recorded performance can carry its own separate protections, and the rights to a particular recording are a different question from the rights to the song on paper. So the fact that the 1930 composition is now public does not automatically mean that the exact ukulele recording used in the episode is free for anyone to do anything with. What it does mean is that the foundational reason for so much of the original trouble, the protected status of the song as a written work, has now expired with the passage of time. The thing that helped keep the first episode out of stores for years has, in its oldest and most basic form, finally aged out of the system that protected it. There is a gentle irony in that ending. The song was chosen, by most accounts, with good feeling, a nod to a sweet and unusual performer who had just died, his fluttering voice carried into a brand new cartoon as a kind of small tribute. That same choice then created years of legal difficulty, kept the show's own beginning off the shelf, and forced the premiere to be hidden away as a bonus feature on a later release. And now, decades after the song was first written, the calendar has quietly undone the oldest part of the knot simply by moving forward the way it always does. The composition is free, the episode is easy to find, the performer is long gone, and the show he briefly lent his voice to has become one of the most successful in television history. What remains is the lesson, and it is a lesson that runs through almost every story of lost media connected to this show. The footage is rarely destroyed. The episodes are rarely truly gone. Instead, they are held back, locked away, or kept incomplete by the quiet machinery of rights and permission, by decisions made in offices far from the bright world of the cartoon itself. A name badge held the original pilot apart from the public. A borrowed song held the first episode off the shelf. In both cases, the show as it was meant to be seen, complete and from the very start, existed just out of reach for years, kept there not by accident or disaster, but by the ordinary complicated business of who owns what. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a single old ukulele recording kept the show's own first episode off store shelves for years, until time itself loosened the oldest part of the knot. But not every missing piece of SpongeBob was hidden by contract. Some scenes were drawn, planned, even storyboarded, and then quietly removed before they ever reached a single screen, and those vanished moments are where we turn next. Section 3. The scenes that never made the final cut. An episode of an animated show is not born finished. It begins as words, then becomes drawings, then becomes a rough version that is closer to a comic book than a cartoon, and only much later does it become the smooth, colored, fully voiced thing that reaches a screen. Each of those stages is a chance to change the story. A joke that seemed funny on paper can fall flat when it is drawn. A scene can run too long and push the episode past the strict number of minutes television slot allows. A moment can feel slightly wrong, slightly unsafe, or slightly off in a way that no one can quite explain until they see it moving. So scenes get cut. They get trimmed for time, dropped for tone, or removed because someone higher up decided they should not be there. Most of the time, the audience never learns what was lost. The episode simply arrives in its final shape, and the missing pieces stay behind in the studio, drawn but never seen. SpongeBob has a long history of these vanished scenes, and a surprising amount is known about them, because the people who made the show preserved their own work. The rough drawings, the storyboards, the early versions of episodes, many of these were kept, and over the years a good number have been shared, either as special features on home video releases, or through the artists themselves showing their old work to fans. What emerges from all of that material is a kind of shadow version of the show, a collection of moments that were planned with care and then quietly set aside. Some of these scenes were fully animated and cut at the last stage. Some were only ever drawn and never brought to life at all. Telling the difference matters, and the surviving evidence does not always make it clear. So honesty requires holding some of these scenes as confirmed and others as likely but uncertain. The richest source of these lost moments comes from a particular corner of the show, the episodes built around the elderly superheroes Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. These two characters, a pair of retired underwater crime fighters living in a nursing home, gave the writers room to build big, busy, action-filled stories, and big stories tend to generate more material than can fit in a short episode. As a result, the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes are where some of the most detailed lost scenes survive, mostly in the form of storyboards that the crew kept and later revealed. One of these episodes, the second in the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy series, appears to have lost several scenes before reaching air. According to storyboards shared by people who worked on it, the episode originally included a moment involving statues. In the version that aired, SpongeBob admires his heroes, but in the cut material, SpongeBob had sculpted likenesses of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy out of Krabby Patties, and a group of judges began to nibble at these patty statues, eating the tribute that SpongeBob had so carefully made. It is a small, strange, sweet idea, the kind of gag that fits the show perfectly, and yet it did not survive into the final episode. The same episode seems to have planned an even larger sequence that may never have been finished. In the storyboards, there is a scene where SpongeBob, Mermaid Man, and Barnacle Boy stand looking at a dam. SpongeBob, in his usual eager and careless way, pulls out the plug, and the result is a flood. This is exactly the sort of physical, world-endangering comedy that a superhero episode invites. But here the record becomes uncertain in an important way. No production material for this scene beyond the storyboard has ever been found. No background paintings, no animation, nothing to suggest it moved past the drawing stage. Because of that, the most honest conclusion is that this flood scene may have been abandoned, early cut while it was still only a sketch, before anyone spent the time and money to animate it. It existed as an intention more than as a finished piece of film. Another cut sequence from that episode rests on firmer ground, and the reason is a single painted background. The storyboards describe a scene in which the heroes try to stop a bank robber. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy attempt to capture the criminal using a ball of water, but they miss and strike SpongeBob instead. SpongeBob, being a sponge, absorbs the water, swells up, and crushes the two old heroes. What makes this scene more than a guess is that a background painting of the bank itself, the Bikini Bottom First Nautical Bank, has survived. A finished background is a meaningful clue. clue, because backgrounds are painted when a scene is genuinely heading toward animation. The existence of that painting suggests this scene was further along than the dam, possibly even animated, before it was removed. A fourth lost scene from the same episode involves a jewelry store. In the planned version, the heroes use their gadgets to close the door of the store, but SpongeBob accidentally breaks the window. Several background paintings for this scene have been found, which again points to a scene that was developed seriously rather than dropped at the sketch stage. And here the story takes a quietly satisfying turn, because nothing in animation is ever truly wasted. That jewelry store, designed and painted for a scene that never aired, was later reused. The same location turned up years afterward in a much later episode of the show, and it also appeared in one of the SpongeBob video games. A piece of a deleted scene became a piece of the living world of the show, just in a different place and a different decade than it was first meant for. Beyond these 4 scenes, that single episode left behind even more loose material, including background paintings for a sequence where the heroes fight cardboard cutouts of their enemy and a dramatic upward shot of a tower. None of it made the final episode. All of it was drawn or painted with the same care as the part that did. The episode that aired was a complete and funny half of a story. The episode that was planned was larger, wilder, and full of moments that now exist only as still images and the memories of the people who made them. The third Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode hides a different kind of lost detail, one that lives inside the show's own ideas rather than its actions. Surviving production art reveals that a character who is now central to the show was originally meant to appear in that episode and was removed for reasons that have never been clearly explained. There is also an unused close-up of one character's teeth, a small piece of animation that was planned and then handled differently in the final version. And there is a genuinely odd early concept buried in the art, a version of the Patty statues idea in which the life-size figures of the heroes were not to be built from Krabby Patty sandwiches at all, but sculpted from raw Krabby Patty meat. It is a tiny difference, a slightly grislier and stranger version of a prop, and it shows how even the smallest objects in the show passed through several ideas before settling into their final form. The 5th Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode may hold the single largest collection of cut material in the entire early run of the show, and in this case the evidence is unusually complete because the deleted scenes were preserved and included as special features on a home video release. The list of what was removed is long and strained. There was a sequence of one hero using a special scope vision power and another showing a press conference held by a group of villains. An ice cream truck was meant to transform into a robot. A fish was supposed to defeat that robot using a disguise. SpongeBob had a moment of pure joy upon discovering the secret entrance to the hero's lair. There was even an explanation of what had really happened to the original League of Heroes, a piece of backstory that the final episode left out. Smaller gags were cut as well, including a moment of Patrick making armpit noises. Perhaps the most interesting lost detail is that SpongeBob, when imagining himself as a hero, was going to be given a superhero name, and that name was the Wizard. There were planned scenes of villains skywriting, of tornadoes, of characters being run over and caught and defeated in the chaos. Almost all of it was cut for the simplest reason in television, which is time. A half hour of programming holds only so many minutes, and these episodes had been written with far more story than those minutes could contain. The cutting of scenes was not limited to the superhero episode. It happened quietly all across the show, often in ways that changed the feeling of a moment by just a few seconds. In one well-loved early episode, a story about a terrible smell and the way the other characters react to it, the ending was originally meant to carry one more line. After SpongeBob and Patrick embraced Squidward and run off, Squidward was going to deliver a final cutting remark, calling them both ugly and smelly in a single breath, a last little insult to close the scene. According to the commentary recorded for the home video release, this line was dropped because the screen was already fading to black and the joke was no longer needed. The episode ends a beat earlier than it was written to. The line exists only in the memory of the people who recorded it and in the commentary where they later mentioned it. Other early episodes lost whole segments to the clock. One famous episode about putting things off, about the misery of trying to write a simple essay and finding every possible excuse not to, originally contained more material than aired. There were additional bits, including a carnival, a race car, and a stretch of imagined athletic activity, all of which were trimmed away to fit the running time. In this case, the cut material was not lost to the audience forever because it was preserved and included on the home video release, where it could be seen by anyone who looked for it. That is the happier version of a deleted scene, the kind that is removed from broadcast, but kept and shared rather than buried. A few cuts were made for reasons closer to caution than to time. In one of the later Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes, a scene was reportedly removed in which furniture inside SpongeBob's head was destroyed, and the explanation passed down through the show's history is that the studio worried the scene might encourage children to damage property in imitation. It is a small example of a pattern that runs throughout the show's life, the constant quiet weighing of what a young audience might copy. A gag that seems harmless to an adult can look different to the people responsible for what millions of children watch, and so it disappears, drawn but never aired, removed not because it was bad, but because it was thought to be unwise. Even the special, holiday-style episodes left behind cut material. material. One unusual episode, framed around a live-action pirate character searching for a missing cartoon, had a deleted storyboard scene in which that pirate tears a SpongeBob bandage off himself in a moment of frustration while destroying his collection of merchandise. The scene was planned, drawn, and then left out, surviving only in the storyboard that the crew kept. Taken together, all of these vanished moments form a strange and gentle catalog. None of them are dramatic in the way the famous fan legends pretend the show's lost material is. There are no horrifying secrets hidden in these cutscenes, no dark intentions, no buried messages. They are simply the ordinary debris of careful creative work. The patty statues that got nibbled, the dam that flooded the town, the jewelry store window that shattered, the superhero name that never stuck, the final insult that faded into black a moment too soon. Each was made with real effort. Each was set aside for a reason that in nearly every case comes down to time, tone, or caution rather than mystery. And each survives now only because the people who made the show were the kind of people who kept their old drawing, who saved their storyboard, and who were willing years later to open those files and let the public see the version of Bikini Bottom that almost was. There is a quiet generosity in that preservation, and it stands in sharp contrast to the way lost media usually work. Most cutscenes from most shows are gone for good, thrown away, or filed in places no one will ever open again. The fact that so much of SpongeBob's deleted material survives at all is the result of choices made by individuals, animators, and storyboard artists who treated their rough work as worth keeping. Without them, the patty statues and the dam and the jewelry store would be nothing more than rumors. Because of them, the shadow version of the show can still be studied, scene by scene, frame by frame, a record of the choices that shaped the cartoon the world actually received. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a whole shadow version of the show survives in storyboards and special features, scenes drawn with care and then quietly set aside for time, tone, or caution. But preserving all of that took work, and much of it nearly slipped away for good. How these scraps were found, saved, and fought over is the story we follow next. Section 4. The Hunt and the Preservation. There is a quiet community of people whose hobby is finding things that were never meant to be found. They are sometimes called preservationists, sometimes archivists, sometimes simply fans, and they spend their time tracking down media that has slipped through the cracks of history. Old commercials, forgotten television specials, pilots that aired once and vanished, scenes that were cut before broadcast. The thing that unites them is a belief that media is worth saving even when the companies that made it have stopped caring, and that a piece of film or a single frame can matter to someone, somewhere, long after the people who created it have moved on. SpongeBob, for all its fame and success, has its own dedicated corner of this world, and the story of how the show's lost material was recovered is in many ways more human than the material itself. The work begins with a problem that sounds simple and turns out to be very hard. A piece of lost media is, by definition, difficult to find. It might exist on a single old tape in someone's closet. It might be locked inside a studio that has no interest in releasing it. It might survive only as a memory, something a person swears they saw years ago, but cannot prove. The job of the preservationist is to turn these vague possibilities into something solid. A file, an image, a video that can be watched and copied and kept. And the way they do this is slow, patient, and often frustrating, built on years of searching, trading, and waiting. For the original pilot of the show, the one made under the earlier name, the hunt stretched across more than a decade. For a long time, the only solid evidence was a handful of images and a description of how the original opening differed from the famous one. Fans passed these fragments around, studied them, and argued about them, but no complete copy of the pilot was publicly available. Then, in the middle of the 2010s, that changed. A member of the lost media community managed to obtain a copy and shared it on a major video sharing site. For the people who had been searching, it was a significant moment, even though the copy was the already renamed version rather than the pure original. A thing that had been spoken about for years was finally something a person could sit down and watch. The relief did not last, and the reason is the central tension that runs through almost all of this work. The footage belongs to a large company, and that company holds the legal rights to it. Sharing it publicly without permission is the kind of thing that gets noticed. Within a few years, the copy on that first video site was removed, taken down on the grounds that it was protected material, being distributed without authorization. The people who valued it did not simply give up. They uploaded it elsewhere, this time to a large public internet archive, a place designed to preserve digital material of all kinds. For a while it lived there. Then it was removed from that archive as well. After that, it surfaced again on a smaller streaming site, quieter and more obscure, the kind of place that draws less attention. This is the rhythm of preserving media that someone else owns. The file appears, gets noticed, gets removed, and reappears somewhere new, always moving, never settling, kept alive by the stubbornness of the people who refused to let it disappear. Around the same time, other pieces of evidence kept turning up in unexpected places, often by accident. A company once produced a video celebrating a major anniversary of its animation history, and hidden inside that video was a brief glimpse of the original pilot, a frame that had not been widely seen. Sharp-eyed members of the community spotted it, recognized what it was, and saved it before the anniversary video itself was later taken down. A few years afterward, a clearer image of the original character wearing wearing his original name badge came to light, an upgrade over the blurry screenshot that had circulated for so long. None of these finds arrived in a grand or dramatic way. They came from people watching carefully, pausing on the right frame, and understanding the significance of something that most viewers would have scrolled right past. Finding a copy is only the first half of the work. The second half is restoration, and this is where the preservation community shows a level of care that can be genuinely surprising. A piece of lost media often survives in poor condition. It might be a copy of a copy, recorded off a television broadcast onto an old tape, then transferred to a computer years later through aging equipment. The colors drift, the image tears at the edges, the sound hisses. A casual viewer might accept this as the best that can be done. The serious preservationists do not. For the original pilot, a number of fans took on the painstaking task of reconstruction, trying to assemble the best possible version from every available source. The methods involved are the kind of thing that takes obsession rather than talent alone. One approach was to take an official master version of the episode, a clean copy without the burned-in captions that some broadcasts carry, and carefully match it against an old tape recording that preserved the original differences. By cutting the clean footage to follow the structure of the older recording, a reconstructor could build a version that looked as good as the master, while remaining faithful to the way the original actually played. There were long discussions among these fans about the deepest technical details, including questions about whether the early footage had originally been stored on physical film, which would explain certain marks and specks of damage visible in some shots. Whether or not every theory was correct, the level of attention is the point. People sat for hours comparing colors, debating whether a difference in tint came from the original print or from an old tape degrading over time, all in service of getting a single short cartoon as close to its true form as possible. None of them were paid for this. None of them owned the footage. They did it because they cared. The deleted scenes and storyboards discussed earlier were preserved through a mix of official and unofficial effort, and the official part deserves recognition. When the show was released on home video, many of those releases included storyboards as special features, the rough drawings that showed how an episode had been planned, sometimes including scenes that never aired. This was a decision made by the people producing the disc, and it meant that a large amount of the show's development material was preserved in a clean, legitimate form, available to anyone who bought the right release. Years later, members of the preservation community took the next step, copying those storyboards from the discs and uploading them to a large public archive, gathering material from many different releases into one place. A person searching today can find storyboards for a wide range of early episodes collected together, a small library of the show's creative process, all because someone took the time to rip them from old discs and organize them. The other great source of preserved material came directly from the people who made the show. Over the years, a number of the storyboard artists, writers, and directors who worked on SpongeBob began sharing their old work on social media platforms. They posted drawings of scenes that had been cut. They explained why certain moments were removed. They confirmed details that fans had wondered about for years. This is an unusual and valuable thing because it means that much of what is known about the show's deleted material does not rest on rumor or guesswork. It rests on the testimony of the people who were actually in the room, holding up their own old drawings and saying, with their own authority, that this scene was real and this is why it did not make it. That same direct involvement of the crew also worked in the opposite direction, and this is one of the most important parts of the whole story. The people who made the show did not only confirm what was real, they also took the time to deny what was false. The world of SpongeBob lost media is crowded with claims, and many of them are not true. There are stories of secret storyboards that do not exist, of hidden episodes that were never made, of dark scenes that were supposedly cut and buried. When these claims spread far enough, members of the crew sometimes stepped in to correct the record, stating plainly that a particular storyboard had never existed, or that a particular rumor was simply wrong. This kind of correction is just as much a part of preservation as finding a lost tape, because preserving the truth of a show's history means clearing away the false stories as carefully as recovering the real ones. A history filled with invented secrets is not preserved. It is buried under fiction. The result of all this effort is a body of recovered material that is genuinely impressive and a set of methods worth understanding. The pilot was found, lost, found again, and reconstructed, surviving through a long chain of uploads and takedowns and patient technical work. The storyboards were preserved first by the studio on home video and then by fans who copied and organized them. The deleted scenes were confirmed by the very artists who drew them, and the false legends were challenged by the very people who would have known if they were true. Each piece of this required a different kind of work, and none of it would have happened on its own. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of the underlying situation, because it explains why so much of this work falls to fans rather than to the company that owns the show. The original pilot, in its true and complete form, has never been officially released to the public by the people who control it. They have the cleanest possible copy. They have the right. They could, if they chose, put out a beautiful, restored version of the show's first appearance and end the hunt forever. They have not done so. And so the task of keeping that footage alive has fallen, by default, to people with no legal claim to it, working with worse copies and constantly fighting the takedowns that the company itself issues. There is a quiet irony in a piece of media being preserved against the wishes of the company that made it, kept alive by the affection of strangers while its owner does nothing with it, but occasionally pull it down. Honesty requires noting that the community's records are not perfect. Many of the dates and details about who uploaded what and when and to which site come from the community's own informal documentation rather than from official record. These accounts are usually careful and usually reliable, but they are the work of volunteers piecing together a history as it happened, and small errors are possible. The reconstructions, too, are limited by their sources. A version rebuilt from an old tape can only ever be as good as that tape allowed, and reconstructors are the first to admit when their work is unfinished or imperfect. None of this undermines the value of what they have done. It simply means that this corner of history, like the lost media itself, is a thing assembled from fragments, held together by effort and good faith, rather than by any official authority. What lingers after walking through all of it is a sense of how much love is poured into keeping these small things from vanishing. A cartoon about a sponge does not need to have its original pilot reconstructed frame by frame. The world would keep turning if a single old screenshot of a name badge had been lost. But it was not lost because someone decided it mattered and then someone else decided it mattered. And together, over many years, they built a record of the show's hidden history that is more complete than almost anyone would expect. The storyboards survive. The deleted scenes are documented. The pilot can still be watched somewhere by anyone willing to look. And the false stories have been answered by the people best placed to answer them. That is preservation, and it is a quieter and kinder thing than the legends that tend to surround this show. Those legends, though, are a story of their own, and they cannot be ignored, because for many people, they are the first and only thing they ever heard about SpongeBob and lost media. The dark tales of hidden episodes, of scenes too disturbing to air, of secrets buried in the animation, have spread far wider than any real storyboard ever did. Where those stories came from, why they spread, and how the people who made the show finally responded to them is where this half of the journey comes to its close. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the real lost media was saved by patient strangers and honest crew members, recovered, restored, and just as carefully separated from fiction. But the fiction never went away. The most famous SpongeBob lost episodes were never real at all, and the strange true story of how those legends began and how the show itself answered them is where we turn next. Section 5. The lost episodes that were never real. Every beloved children's show eventually attracts a darker shadow, and it usually comes from the audience rather than the creator. There is something in people, especially people who grew up loving a thing, that wants to imagine a hidden, frightening version of it. The brighter and more innocent the show, the stronger the pull. A cheerful cartoon about a sponge who lives in a pineapple and loves his job seems on its surface like the last place anyone would look for horror, and that is exactly why it became one of the most popular targets for it. The contrast is the appeal. Taking the most relentlessly happy cartoon on television and imagining a secret episode full of dread is a kind of dark game, and for a stretch of years on the internet, it was a game that millions of people played. To understand how this happened, it helps to understand the era it grew out of. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, a particular style of online horror fiction became enormously popular. These stories were short, written to be passed from person to person, and designed to feel real. They often took the form of a first-hand account told plainly, as if the writer were simply describing something true that had happened to them. The whole craft of these stories was built on believability. A good one did not feel like fiction. It felt like a confession, or a warning, or a piece of leaked information from someone who had seen something they were not supposed to see. This style of writing spread through forums and message boards, and it developed its own traditions, its own recurring ideas, and its own loyal community of writers and readers. Out of this culture grew a specific and very popular kind of story, the lost episode tale. The idea is simple and powerful. The writer claims to have come across an episode of a famous show that was never meant to air, a cursed or disturbing or secret installment that the studio buried. Because real shows genuinely do have an aired pilot, deleted scenes, and material locked in vault, the premise has a thin layer of plausibility right from the start. Everyone vaguely knows that studios keep things hidden. Everyone has heard of an episode being pulled. The lost episode story takes that small, true fact and stretches it into something monstrous, inventing a hidden episode so disturbing that the people who saw it were never the same. For a show as wholesome and as widely watched as SpongeBob, the format was irresistible, and the show became the subject of one of the most famous lost episode stories ever written. That story first appeared in the spring of 2010. According to the records kept by the communities that track these things, it was posted by an anonymous author to the paranormal section of an online image board, a place where people shared exactly this kind of unsettling fiction. The story was framed as a personal account. The narrator claimed to have worked as an intern at the studio that produced SpongeBob back in the middle of the 2000s, and to have been present when the staff sat down to review an episode before it aired. In the story, the episode that was supposed to play turned out to be something else entirely, a disturbing and unauthorized version that horrified everyone in the room. The narrator describes the staff growing more and more uneasy as the footage continued, until it became clear that something deeply wrong had been inserted inserted into what should have been an ordinary cartoon. The choice to make the narrator an intern at the studio was a clever one, and it is a large part of why the story worked. An intern is a believable witness. An intern would plausibly be in a room watching unfinished episodes, would plausibly see things the public never sees, and would plausibly have no power to stop or explain what was happening. The framing gave the story a sense of access, a feeling that the reader was being let in on something genuine. It is a small detail, but it is the kind of detail that separates a story people forget from a story that spreads across the entire internet. The story also came with an image, and the image may have mattered even more than the word. Alongside the text circulated an edited picture of Squidward, the show's grumpy octopus, altered to look frightening, with reddened eyes and dark streaks running down his face. This picture became known by its own name and took on a life of its own, separate from the story that birthed it. A piece of writing can be argued with and forgotten. An image lodges in the mind. The altered picture of Squidward gave the legend a face, something that could be shared on its own, reposted, stumbled upon, and remembered long after the details of the story faded. For a great many people, that single disturbing image was the entire experience of the legend, encountered without context, frightening precisely because it had been pulled from a show they associated with comfort and safety. Now, the most important fact, and the one this section exists to make absolutely clear: the story is fiction. It is not a real episode. There was no cursed footage, no buried premiere, no horrifying secret version of the show reviewed by traumatized staff. The entire thing was written as a piece of online horror fiction, in the same tradition as the thousands of other such stories that filled those forums at the time. The communities that document these tales state plainly that it is fake, and they explain how the visual material that sometimes accompanied it was assembled by editing together pieces of ordinary, real episodes and altering them for effect. No part of it came from the studio. No part of it was ever planned, drawn, or animated by the people who made the show. It is a story written by a fan, designed to frighten other fans, and nothing more. The proof of this is unusually strong, because the author eventually came forward. A few years after the story first appeared, a person posted online claiming to be the one who had written it, openly admitting authorship of the tale. This is a meaningful moment in the history of the legend, because it removes any lingering doubt. The story did not leak from a vault. It was not whispered out of the studio by a frightened witness. It was composed by a writer who later raised a hand and said that they had made it up. The mystery, such as it was, had an ordinary and human answer all along. Someone wrote a scary story, and it became far more famous than they could have imagined. What happened next is its own small chapter in internet history, and it shows just how powerful the format had become. The story was so successful, so widely read and copied, that it spawned a flood of imitators. Other writers rushed to create their own lost episode tales about SpongeBob and about countless other shows, each trying to recapture the same effect. There was even a separate alternate version of the SpongeBob story, written later by a different author, which many people came to confuse with the original. For the record, that later version was a kind of remake or expansion, not the source, even though plenty of people online have mistakenly treated it as the first. The wave of imitations grew so large, and so much of it was so poorly written, that the online encyclopedias dedicated to these horror stories eventually took an extraordinary step. They banned the lost episode format outright. The genre had become so flooded, so repetitive, and so tired that the communities built around this kind of fiction decided they no longer wanted any more of it. A single SpongeBob story had helped inspire so many copies that an entire category of horror writing was shut down to stop the tide. The original story also left a mark on the language of these communities. It is often credited with popularizing a particular phrase used to describe the disturbing imagery in these tales, a phrase meant to convey that the cursed footage looked unnervingly real, more detailed and lifelike than ordinary animation. The phrase was used so heavily in the wake of the SpongeBob story, and copied so mindlessly by imitators, that it became almost a joke within the community, a tired marker of an unimaginative writer. That a single piece of fan fiction about a cartoon sponge could shape the vocabulary of an entire genre says a great deal about how far its influence spread. Through all of this, the people who actually made the show watched the legend grow, and in time, they responded to it in two different ways. The first was direct correction. Members of the crew, including senior people who would have known the truth, made clear in public statements that the story was nonsense, describing it as exactly the kind of overwrought fan fiction it was, and stressing that none of it had any connection to the real show. This kind of plain denial from the actual creators is important because it cuts the legend off at its root. The story relied on the idea that it came from inside the studio. The studio's own people saying that it did not remove the one thing that gave it power. The second response was stranger and more playful, and it is the reason the legend earns a place in a story about the real history of the show, rather than being dismissed entirely. Years after the tale first spread, the show itself acknowledged it. In one episode, the crew slipped in a brief nod to the famous altered image of Squidward, a quick visual reference that only viewers familiar with the legend would recognize. It was a small wink, an inside joke aimed at the grown-up fans who had encountered the story online and were no longer the show's young target audience. The people who made the show were essentially acknowledging the legend's fame while gently mocking it, treating it as the ridiculous fan creation it was, rather than as something to fear. That brief reference would go on to have its own complicated history involving censorship, a story that belongs to the second half of this video. But the act itself, the show reaching out to tip its hat to a fan-made horror story, is a fitting end to the legend. The tale that pretended to come from inside the studio was finally answered by the studio, not with horror, but with a joke. It is worth sitting for a moment with the contrast between this section and the ones that came before it, because the contrast is the whole point. The real lost media of SpongeBob is, almost without exception, mundane. A character with a slightly different name on his badge. A song that could not be cleared for home video. A handful of gags cut it because an episode ran too long. Patty statues nibbled by judges. A jewelry store window that shattered in a scene no one ever saw. These are the genuine secrets of the show, and they are small, ordinary, and quietly human. The fake lost media, by contrast, is lurid, dramatic, and frightening, full of buried horrors and traumatized witnesses and cursed footage. And it is the fake version that spread the furthest. Far more people have seen the altered image of Squidward than have ever seen a single real deleted storyboard. Far more people believe, somewhere in the back of their minds, that there is a disturbing hidden episode of SpongeBob than know the true and gentle story of the renamed pilot. That gap between what is real and what is believed is the most interesting thing about this entire subject. The truth of the show's lost material is a story about business, about time, about caution, and about the patient work of people who wanted to preserve a cartoon they love. The legend is a story about fear, about the dark pleasure of imagining innocence corrupted, and about how easily a well-told lie can outrun a quiet truth. Both are part of the show's history now, permanently tangled together, and a careful look at SpongeBob and lost media has to include both the real scenes that were cut and saved and the false ones that were invented and spread. The difference is simply that one set of stories actually happened and the other never did. With that, the first half of this journey reaches its end. The hidden history of what was lost, locked away, cut, recovered, and imagined has been laid out as completely and as honestly as the record allows. But there is a second kind of hidden SpongeBob, and it is not lost at all. It is the show that aired and was then quietly changed. The scenes that were broadcast once and then altered. The episodes pulled from the schedule. The frames replaced. The moments that exist in one version of the show and not another, depending on the year and the country and the decision of someone in an office. That is the territory ahead, and it begins with a single, infamous scene involving a bucket of gasoline. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the most famous SpongeBob horror was never real, a piece of fan fiction that outran the truth until the show itself answered it with a joke. But the show holds plenty of real altered moments, scenes that aired and were then quietly changed. The first of them is a vanished burst of fire, and that is where we go next. Section 6. The gasoline that disappeared. A person can be certain they saw a scene, certain of how it looked and how it made them feel, and then discover that the scene is gone, that the episode they are watching now skips right past the moment they remember so clearly. It can make a person doubt their own memory, wondering if they imagined it, if they confused it with something else, if it was ever really there at all. For a long time, this exact feeling settled over a particular SpongeBob scene, a short burst of fire near the end of an early episode that a great many people remembered, and that for most of them simply was not there anymore. The episode is an early one, from the show's third season, a story in which SpongeBob tries to convince a stubborn Squidward to taste a Krabby Patty for the first time. Squidward refuses, insults the very idea, and then in secret develops a desperate hunger for the thing he claimed to hate. The story builds toward a late night scene in which Squidward sneaks into the Krusty Krab, alone in the dark, intending to break into the vault where the patties are kept and take one for himself. He believes he is safe. He believes no one is watching. And in the version of the episode that originally aired, this is where something happened that the show would soon decide to erase. In that original version, Squidward triggers a hidden security system as he creeps through the restaurant. He encounters a bucket of liquid and assumes it is water, harmless, part of some clumsy trap. He is wrong. The liquid is gasoline, and a mechanism drops a flame into it, and the result is a sudden, violent explosion. Squidward is caught in the blast and emerges scorched and blackened. Moments later, stumbling into the kitchen, he sets off a second trap, and the room erupts into flame again. The whole sequence lasts only a matter of seconds, but it is loud, bright, and far more intense than the gentle comedy the show usually trades in. It was animated, it was approved, and it was broadcast. People saw it, and then, very quietly, it went away. The removal happened early, only a few months after the episode first aired. In the edited version that replaced it, the explosion is simply gone. Rather than triggering the trap and being engulfed in fire, Squidward moves smoothly from sneaking through the restaurant to standing in the kitchen, unharmed, with the camera sliding over to the patty vault as if nothing dramatic had happened at all. The cut is not clean in the way a careful edit might be. The transition feels abrupt to anyone paying attention, a small jump that hints at something missing without explaining what. For years, this edited version became the only one most people could find. The fire vanished from television, from the home video releases, from nearly every place a person might go looking for the episode. The scene that so many remembered had been removed so thoroughly that its absence became a kind of presence, a gap fans could feel even when they could not prove it. The question that has hung over this scene ever since is a simple one. Why was it cut? cut, and the answer even now is not entirely settled, which is part of what makes the scene so quietly haunting. There is no single, clean, official explanation that everyone agrees on. Instead, there are several accounts offered at different times by different people, and they do not all line up perfectly, leaving a small, permanent uncertainty at the heart of the story. The first and most widely believed explanation has to do with timing, and the timing is genuinely unsettling. The episode first aired in the early autumn of 2001, less than a month after the attacks of September the 11th. In the weeks and months that followed those attacks, a deep nervousness settled over American media. Networks pulled films, delayed episodes, and quietly edited out anything that resembled disaster, destruction, or sudden violence. Images that would have passed without comment a year earlier suddenly felt raw and dangerous. A cartoon in which a character is engulfed in a fiery explosion, airing in that exact window, was the kind of thing that could easily have drawn concern. For many people, this is the obvious explanation. The scene was removed because the country was grieving, and a sudden burst of fire in a children's show felt wrong in a way it never had before. There is a second explanation, and it has nothing to do with tragedy and everything to do with imitation. The scene shows a character setting fire to gasoline using a flame. That is a specific, real, dangerous action, the kind of thing a network worries that a young viewer might try to copy. Television aimed at children is governed by careful rules about what can be shown, and one of the firmest of those rules concerns actions that a child could actually imitate and be harmed by. A bucket of gasoline and a source of fire is exactly that kind of action. By this explanation, the scene was cut not because of any national event, but because someone reviewing it decided that depicting how to ignite gasoline, even as a joke, even in a cartoon, was simply too risky to keep. What makes the story interesting is that the people who actually made the show have spoken about it over the years, and their accounts blend these explanations together while shading them differently. One of the writers connected to the episode addressed the question some years after the fact, explaining that the original, unedited version had genuinely passed through every level of network approval before it aired. The scene was not slipped in against the rules. It was checked, cleared, and broadcast properly. According to this account, the decision to remove it came afterward, and the attacks of that September were a major factor in that later decision, working together with the standards concern. In other words, the scene was fine until the world changed around it, and then a combination of the national mood and the content rules turned an approved gag into something the show no longer wanted on the air. Later, a senior figure on the show offered a description that leaned in a slightly different direction. Speaking publicly many years afterward, this person framed the removal primarily as a standards matter, emphasizing that the network was simply against a gag built around a match and gasoline, the imitable danger of it, rather than placing the weight on the events of that autumn. The two accounts are not flatly contradictory. Both mention the content rules. Both acknowledge that the scene was removed rather than blocked from the start, but they differ in emphasis, in how much weight they place on the tragedy versus the simple danger of the gag, and that difference is enough to leave the true reasons slightly out of focus. The honest conclusion is that the scene was almost certainly removed for some combination of these reasons, and that the exact balance between them depends on who is telling the story and when. The mystery deepens, in a quiet way, when the show's own later behavior is taken into account. Many years after this scene was scrubbed away, in a much later season, the show used a gag involving a match and gasoline again, this time in the climax of an episode that aired without controversy. When this apparent inconsistency was pointed out, the explanation offered came down to a single distinction: the idea that the difference lay in whether the action was something a child could realistically imitate. By this reasoning, the later gag was framed in a way that did not teach or model the dangerous act, while the original scene did. Whether that distinction fully holds up is the kind of thing fans can argue about endlessly, and the argument is part of the appeal. A scene was deemed too dangerous to keep, and then a similar idea was allowed back in under slightly different conditions, and the line between the two is fine enough that it invites exactly the kind of close, obsessive analysis that this corner of the show's history tends to attract. The geography of the scene's survival adds its own eerie texture. The cut was made for certain markets, but it was not made everywhere at once, and so for years the uncut version continued to air in scattered corners of the world while it vanished from others. In one country to the north, the original scene with the fire intact continued to play on television for some time. In a few countries across Asia and Europe, the scene survived in dubbed or voiced over versions, the explosions still present, simply spoken in another language. This created the strange situation in which the same episode existed in two forms at the same moment, depending entirely on where a person happened to be sitting. A child in one country saw Squidward burst into flame. A child in another saw him slide harmlessly into the kitchen. Neither knew that the other version existed. The show was, in a small but real way, a different show depending on the map. That division did not last forever, and over time the uncut version grew harder and harder to find, even in the places that had once preserved it. The broadcaster that had kept the original on the air eventually lost the right to show the program at all, which closed off one of the last reliable places to see the scene on television. The home video releases used the edited version. The digital releases used the edited version. With each passing year, the original drifted further toward the status of lost media, surviving mainly through old recordings that fans had made and kept copies of a copy, passed around quietly among people who wanted to remember the show as it first was. There was even an obscure format, a small portable video device from that era that happened to carry the uncut scene, becoming one of the few official products that preserved the fire. Beyond a handful of such oddities, the original sequence became something that lived mostly in memory and in the careful archives of dedicated fans. The afterlife of the scene took an unexpected turn as well, because the very thing that made it too dangerous to broadcast made it perfect for the internet. As the years passed and the scene became known as a hidden, removed piece of the show, it transformed into a kind of celebrated artifact. Clips of the explosion circulated online. The image of a scorched, blackened Squidward became a recognizable piece of internet culture, shared and referenced by people who treated it less as something frightening and more as a beloved relic of a more chaotic era of children's television. A scene that had been quietly buried out of caution became, decades later, one of the most famous deleted moments in the show's history, precisely because it had been hidden. The act of removal that was meant to make people forget it instead helped ensure that they never would. What lingers after walking slowly through all of it is the uncertainty itself. Most stories about censorship end with a clear reason. Something was shown, someone objected, and the objection is on the record. This scene resists that kind of tidy ending. It was approved and aired, and then it was taken away, and the people who took it away have given accounts that overlap but do not perfectly agree. The timing points toward grief. The content points toward caution. The later use of a similar gag points toward a distinction that is real but delicate. And the truth, in the end, is probably all of these things at once, tangled together in a decision made quietly in a difficult autumn, never fully explained, never officially closed. A short scene of fire in a cartoon about a sponge should not carry this much weight. It is a few seconds of comic exaggeration, a gag built on the simple surprise of a bucket that turns out to hold something far more dangerous than water. But because it vanished, and because it vanished at such a charged moment, and because the reasons were never made perfectly clear, it became something more than a gag. It became a small mystery folded into the history of the show, a scene that exists and does not exist at the same time, remembered by millions and findable by few, the kind of quiet, unresolved thing that rewards a slow and patient look. The fire was real. The reasons are a fog, and somewhere in that fog is the truth of why a children's show decided, all those years ago, that a burst of flame was something its young audience was better off never seeing again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a scene of fire aired once, then quietly vanished for reasons that were never fully agreed upon, surviving only in memory and scattered recordings. But a single removed scene is one thing. An entire episode pulled from the schedule and locked away for years is another. And that quieter, stranger disappearance is where we turn next. Section 7. The episode pulled from the schedule. An episode of a long-running show is rarely watched once and then forgotten. It enters something called syndication, a kind of endless rerun, where it plays again and again over the years, slotted into afternoon schedules and late-night blocks, becoming part of the steady background hum of television. A child might see the same episode a dozen times across a childhood without ever choosing to. It simply arrives, the way weather arrives, and over enough years it becomes woven into the texture of growing up. Episodes like this do not feel like individual works so much as familiar furniture, always there, always the same. So when one of them quietly disappears, when an episode that played for years suddenly stops appearing and cannot be found, the absence has a particular weight. It is the feeling of a piece of furniture being removed from a room while no one was looking, leaving only the faint mark where it used to sit. One SpongeBob episode carries this feeling more than almost any other. It first aired in early 2003, in the middle of the show's celebrated early run. It is paired with another short story, as the episodes of this era usually are, and on its surface it is built from the same gentle comedy as everything around it. The story follows Mr. Krabs, the money-obsessed crab who runs the Krusty Krab, as he sinks into a crisis about growing old. He feels that his best years are behind him, that he has become dull and stale, and he longs to feel young again. SpongeBob and Patrick, ever loyal and ever clueless, take it upon themselves to help him recapture his youth by taking him out for a wild night. A series of adventures meant to make an aging crab feel alive once more. For most of its length, the episode plays exactly as one would expect. There are jokes about how out of touch Mr. Krabs has become, gentle gags about age and embarrassment, the familiar rhythm of two enthusiastic friends trying and failing to be cool. But the night out builds toward a final escapade, and it is that ending that would, many years later, pull the entire episode off the air. In the climactic scene, the trio sneaks into a house to steal women's undergarments as a kind of daring prank, the sort of juvenile mischief the characters treat as the height of youthful rebellion. The scene is played for comedy, and it ends with a twist that turns the prank back on Mr. Krabs in an embarrassing way. For the better part of 15 years, this ending aired without incident, watched countless times by countless children. Just another strange and silly SpongeBob adventure among hundreds. Then, at some point around 2018, it stopped. The episode quietly fell out of the rotation. It was no longer scheduled, no longer played in the afternoon block, no longer part of the endless rerun cycle that kept the rest of the show in constant motion. ocean. At first, this kind of disappearance is easy to miss. An episode not airing for a while is not unusual. Schedules change, certain episodes get played more than others, and a single missing story can go unnoticed for a long time. But this absence did not end. The episodes simply never came back, and slowly the people who paid attention began to realize that one of the show's early episodes had been silently retired. The explanation, when it eventually came, was stated plainly by the network, though only after people had begun asking questions. A representative for the network confirmed that the episode had been taken out of rotation following a review of the show's content. In that review, the network had determined that some elements of the story were not appropriate for children. The wording was careful and corporate, the kind of statement designed to close a subject rather than open it, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone had looked again at that final scene, at the prank involving the undergarments and the way the episode treated it, and decided that it did not belong in a program aimed at young viewers. The episode had aired for 15 years, and then a fresh pair of eyes had looked at it through the standards of a later time and quietly pulled it from the schedule. This is one of the most fascinating things about the way television ages. An episode does not change. The footage made in 2003 is exactly the same footage years later, frame for frame, joke for joke. What changes is the world around it and the standards that the world applies. A scene that seemed like harmless juvenile comedy in one era can look different in another, and the people responsible for what children watch are constantly re-reviewing old material against new expectations. The episode was not pulled because it had suddenly become offensive. It was pulled because the line of what was considered acceptable had shifted, and a scene that once sat safely inside that line now sat outside it. The episode stood still, and the world moved around it, and eventually the gap between them grew wide enough that the episode had to go. The disappearance did not stop at the broadcast schedule. A few years after it vanished from television, in the early 2020s, the episode was removed from the major streaming services as well. The platforms where viewers had grown, used to finding any episode they wanted at any time, quietly dropped it from their catalog. It was no longer available to stream on the services that carried the rest of the show. It was even removed from a major online store where episodes could be purchased, meaning that a person could not simply buy it to watch. The episode that had once been inescapable, playing on a loop for a decade and a half, had become genuinely difficult to obtain through any official channel. It still existed on older home video releases, on discs that people already owned, and pieces of it surfaced in clips online, but the easy, official, push-of-a-button access that defines modern viewing had been closed off entirely. The same wave of removals swept up a second episode, and its story is different in a revealing way. This second episode came from a much later season, and it was pulled at the same time as the first, but for an entirely separate reason. Its plot, by pure coincidence, involved a contagious illness. In the story, a health inspector arrives at the Krusty Krab and discovers that someone inside is carrying a sickness, a kind of invented flu, and as a result, everyone in the restaurant is sealed inside and forced into quarantine. Panic spread. The characters grow suspicious of one another. The whole thing is played as comedy, a farce about fear and confinement and the way people turn on each other when they are frightened and trapped together. The unsettling part is the timing. This episode was written and produced well before the global pandemic that began in 2020 by a margin of about 2 years. The people who made it had no way of knowing what was coming. They wrote a silly story about a fake illness and a quarantine purely as a joke, a setup for comedy. And then the real world delivered something that made the joke impossible to watch the same way. When a genuine pandemic swept across the world, bringing real quarantines, real fear, and real isolation, an episode about a contagious outbreak and a forced confinement suddenly stopped being funny. The network pulled it, explaining that it was being held back out of sensitivity to the real and ongoing pandemic that the world was living through. The episode had not changed at all. The world had simply caught up to its premise in the most painful possible way, turning a harmless cartoon about a made-up flu into something that felt raw and inappropriate. These two removals, happening side by side, illustrate two completely different reasons an episode can vanish, and the difference between them is worth sitting with. The first episode was pulled because of what it contained, a scene judged inappropriate by the standards of a later time. That is a permanent kind of problem, rooted in the content itself. The second was pulled because of when it happened to be seen, a story whose meaning was changed by events far outside the show. That is a temporary kind of problem, tied to a moment rather than to the episode itself, and the eventual fates of the two episodes reflect that difference. The pandemic episode, whose only fault was bad timing, was quietly returned to availability once the worst of the real crisis had passed. Made watchable again after about a year, its premise no longer feeling like an open wound. The other episode, the one pulled for its content, had a far stranger and less settled future. That future is where the story becomes genuinely odd and where it earns its place among the show's quiet mystery. The content episode did not simply stay buried. At one point, during a special live broadcast event, it unexpectedly aired, appearing on a temporary channel despite having been removed from rotation years earlier. For a brief moment, the banned episode was simply there again, playing live, as if its removal had been forgotten or set aside. Observers noticed and remarked on the strangeness of it, an episode declared inappropriate suddenly flickering back onto a screen. Then, a couple of years after that, the episode quietly returned to one of the major streaming services. After years of being unavailable, it was suddenly watchable again, restored to the catalog as if it had never left. And here is the part that keeps the story open rather than closing it. No clear official reason was given for why it came back. It was pulled with an explanation, however brief, and then it returned with none. The episode that had been deemed unfit for children was, after a long absence, simply made available once more, and the people who controlled it offered no account of what had changed. This is the texture that makes the episode feel less like a simple case of censorship and more like a small ongoing mystery. Its availability has flickered. It aired for 15 years, then vanished, then briefly reappeared on a live channel, then returned to streaming without explanation. At no point has there been a clean, final stated resolution. The standards that pulled it were never publicly revised. The decision to bring it back was never publicly justified. The episodes drift in and out of reach, present and absent by turns, governed by decisions made quietly in offices and announced, when they are announced at all, in the briefest possible terms. A viewer trying to understand its status would find a moving target, an episode whose place in the show's official library seems to depend on the year, the platform, and the mood of whoever is making the call. There is something fitting, and a little melancholy, in the fact that this particular episode is the one that became so unstable. At its heart, it is a story about aging, about a character terrified of being old and forgotten and irrelevant, desperate to feel young and alive again. And the episode itself has now lived a version of that fear. It was young and everywhere once, played constantly, part of the daily fabric of the show. Then it was set aside, deemed past time, no longer fit for the audience it once entertained. It has spent years in a kind of limbo, occasionally surfacing, never quite gone and never quite restored, an old thing that the world is not sure what to do with. The crab in the story wanted desperately to matter again. The episode that contains him has spent years quietly fighting the same battle, vanishing and returning, unwanted and then quietly allowed back, its fate decided by forces it cannot see. What remains in the end is an episode that exists in a strange and unsettled state. It was made, it aired, it was loved, it was judged, and it was removed, and then it was partly unremoved in ways that were never fully explained. It can be watched again now for the moment, though there is no guarantee that will remain true, because nothing about its history suggests stability. It is a reminder that the library of a long-running show is not a fixed and permanent thing. It is a living collection, constantly reviewed, quietly edited, with episodes slipping out of reach and occasionally slipping back, shaped by standards that shift with the years, and by decisions that the audience almost never get to see. The furniture can be removed from the room. Sometimes, just as quietly, it can be carried back in, and the only way to know which episodes are present on any given day is to look, and to notice the faint marks where the missing ones used to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a beloved episode aired for 15 years before quietly slipping out of reach, flickering in and out of availability for reasons never fully explained. But sometimes it is not a whole episode that vanishes, only a single image, swapped out so quietly that most viewers never notice the replacement. That one strange replaced frame is where we go next. Section 8. The frame they replaced animation is built out of single images, one after another, flashing past so quickly that the eye blends them into motion. A single second of a cartoon can contain a dozen or more of these images, each one a separate drawing, each one on screen for a fraction of a moment. Because of this, the smallest possible unit of change in an animated show is the frame, one lone image among thousands. And because a frame is so small, it is also one of the easiest things in the world to quietly swap. A scene can be cut and the cut will be felt. An episode can be pulled and the absence will be noted. But a single image, replaced with another image of the same length, can slip by almost without a trace, leaving the rest of the scene intact while changing the one thing someone wanted gone. This is the story of one such replacement, a single strange image that the show first chose to include, then decided to erase, leaving behind a seam that careful viewers can still feel. To understand the image, it helps to remember the legend from the first half of this story. Years before this episode aired, a piece of fan-made horror fiction about the show had spread across the internet, a fake account of a disturbing lost episode centered on Squidward. That story had come with an altered picture, a version of Squidward changed to look frightening, with reddened eyes and dark streaks running down his face. The picture had taken on a life of its own, becoming one of the most recognizable images in the entire culture of online horror story, instantly familiar to anyone who had spent time in those corners of the internet. It was never real. It was never part of the show. It was a fan creation, edited together, and passed around for years, the visual face of a story that the show's own crew had dismissed as ridiculous. And then in a later season, the show did something remarkable. It put that image into an actual episode. The episode in question is a strange one even by the show's standard. In it, SpongeBob and Squidward find themselves delivering an order to a bizarre, surreal place, a realm of nonsense and unsettling sight where the normal rules of their world do not apply. The whole segment is built around the uncanny, around things that look almost right but are subtly wrong, which made it the perfect setting for a small, knowing scare. At one point in this strange place, Squidward opens a series of doors. Behind one of them, for just a moment, the show flashed the famous altered image, the frightening fan-made version of Squidward, the very picture that had haunted the internet internet for years. Squidward, seeing this nightmarish reflection of himself, recoils and cries out that the place is a nightmare, and the moment passes. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, knowing wink aimed squarely at the older fans who had grown up alongside the show and who would instantly recognize the reference. The crew were essentially acknowledging the legend, reaching out across the years to tip their hat to the most famous piece of fan horror their show had ever inspired. Members of the crew later spoke about it with a kind of affectionate amusement. One person involved in the episode's creation described being uncertain whether the reference would even make it through the approval process, surprised that such an edgy nod had been allowed at all. The intent was clearly playful. The show was poking fun at the whole tradition of overwrought, try-hard fan fiction, treating the legend as the absurd thing it was by dropping it into a deliberately ridiculous setting. It was the show laughing at its own dark mythology, and for the fans who caught it, it was a delightful and surprising moment of recognition. But a joke that lands with grown-up fans is a different thing from a joke aimed at children who make up the show's core audience. The frightening image, however knowing and ironic its inclusion, was still a frightening image, and it was appearing in a program watched by very young viewers who had never heard of the legend and would have no way to understand the reference. To a child, there was no inside joke. There was only a sudden, disturbing picture of a familiar character transformed into something scary. And so, as with the gasoline scene years before, the show's own caution caught up with its own daring. The image that the crew had been almost giddy to sneak in became the image that the standards process decided had to go. The removal happened in the part of the world where the episode had first aired, with the image intact toward the end of 2019. And the way it was handled is the heart of what makes this story so peculiar. The crew did not cut the scene. They did not remove the moment where Squidward opens the door and recoils in horror. The structure of the scene, the timing, the build-up, the reaction, all of it stayed exactly the same. What changed was the single image behind the door. In place of the frightening, altered Squidward, the show inserted something completely harmless and absurd. An image of Squidward rendered as a baby. A silly and innocent picture with none of the menace of the original. The door still opens. Squidward still recoils and cries out about the nightmare. But now the thing he is reacting to is not a horror at all. It is a goofy, babyish version of himself. An image that gives no reason for the terror he expresses. This swap created one of the strangest seams in the entire show, a small flaw that becomes obvious the moment a person knows to look for it. Squidward's reaction was animated and recorded for the original frightening image. His horror, his recoil, his cry that the place is a nightmare, all of it was built to match a genuinely disturbing sight. When that sight was replaced with a harmless baby image, the reaction was left untouched, and so the scene no longer quite makes sense. A character is shown reacting in abject terror to something that is, in the edited version, merely silly. The emotional logic of the moment breaks. The performance points at one thing while the image shows another, and the gap between them is the ghost of the censored frame, the empty space where the real joke used to live. The strangeness deepens when the different versions around the world are compared, because the change was not handled identically everywhere, and some of the results are genuinely eerie. In some regions, the scene was not edited by swapping the image at all, but by removing the entire moment, skipping past the troublesome door so that the sequence simply moves along without it. In those versions, the reference never existed for the viewer, cleanly excised, but the most unsettling outcome appeared in certain dubbed versions, the editions of the episode prepared for other languages. In a number of these, the visual was changed to the harmless baby image, just as it was elsewhere, but the original audio was left in place. The sound that had been created to accompany the frightening image, the unsettling noise that went with the original scare, remained, now playing over the innocent baby picture. The result is a small piece of accidental horror that is arguably stranger than the thing it was meant to replace. A silly image of a baby paired with the eerie sound of a nightmare, a mismatch that no one designed on purpose, but that exists nonetheless in the official versions of the show in some parts of the world. The crew's own feelings about the censorship were, by the accounts that surfaced afterward, surprisingly relaxed and even amused. One person connected to the episode reacted to the news that the moment had been censored with something close to delight, treating the whole affair as a fun part of the episode's strange life. The showrunner, addressing the matter publicly, was straightforward about why the reference had been included and why it had to go. He explained that the original fan story it referenced was nothing more than absurd fan fiction, that the reference was meant to mock exactly that kind of edgy, attention-seeking writing, and he was clear that the frightening version of Squidward was in no way an official part of the show's world. The image was a joke about a joke, a reference to a fake thing, and when the standards process decided it was too much for young viewers, the crew seemed to have accepted the change with good humor rather than frustration. They had gotten away with the joke long enough for the fans to see it, and the censorship itself became part of the fun. There is something worth pausing on in the full shape of this story, because it folds the two halves of this entire journey together in a single moment. The first half of this story was, in large part, about the gap between the show's real history and the false legends that grew up around it, and about how the fake lost episodes spread far wider than any true deleted scene ever did. This censored frame is the exact point where those two threads cross. The show, the real thing made by the real people, reached out and deliberately deliberately referenced the most famous fake thing ever attached to it. The legend that had been invented by a fan, dismissed by the crew, and spread across the world was suddenly, briefly, made canon as a joke, drawn into an actual broadcast episode. And then, almost immediately, it was pulled back out, censored away, replaced with a baby. The fake thing touched the real thing for a single frame, and then the real thing erased it, leaving only a seam, a broken reaction, and in some versions, an eerie sound playing over a harmless picture. The whole episode becomes, in this light, a small parable about the relationship between a show and its audience. The fans created a dark legend out of their love for the show. The show, made by people who were also fans of their own creation, acknowledged that legend with affection and mischief. The forces that protect the show's young audience then stepped in and undid the acknowledgement, because what is a charming reference to a grown-up is simply a scary picture to a child. Every party in this story was acting reasonably. The fans were playing, the crew were playing along, the standards process was doing its job, and the result of all these reasonable actions is a strange, broken, fascinating little moment, a door that opens onto terror in one version and silliness in another, a reaction that no longer matches its cause. For the people who study this kind of thing, the replaced frame is a small treasure precisely because of its seam. A perfect, invisible edit teaches nothing. It is the imperfect edit, the ones that leave a trace, that reveal how the machinery works. The mismatch reaction shows exactly what was changed and what was left alone. The surviving audio in some versions shows that the sound and the image are separate things, edited on different tracks, capable of falling out of step with one another. The whole moment is a kind of accidental documentary about how a single image gets swapped in a finished cartoon, visible only because the swap was not quite seamless. The show tried to make the change disappear, and in failing to make it fully disappear, it left behind a clearer record of the change than a perfect edit ever could. What lingers, in the end, is the image of that door. In one version of the show, it opens onto a genuine fright, a knowing nod to years of fan legend, a moment of dark play between creators and audience. In another version, the same door opens onto a baby, harmless and absurd, while a character screams in terror at nothing. Somewhere in some countries, the door opens onto the baby while the sound of the original nightmare still plays, a small piece of horror assembled by accident out of the seams of censorship. The frame that was meant to be erased is, in a strange way, more present now than it ever would have been if it had simply been left alone. It was removed, and the removal made it unforgettable, the same fate that befell the vanished fire years before. The show keeps trying to take certain things back, and the taking back keeps leaving marks, and the marks keep drawing the eye to exactly the thing that someone wanted no one to see. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a single frame carried a hidden joke, then was swapped for a harmless one, leaving a broken reaction and an eerie mismatch behind. But not every change in the show is so dramatic or so famous. Some are tiny, quiet trims that almost no one ever noticed, small edits hiding inside familiar episodes, and those nearly invisible changes are where we turn next. Section 9, the small edits nobody announced. Most censorship announces itself, even quietly. A scene goes missing and the absence is felt. An episode vanishes and people eventually notice. A frightening image is replaced and the broken reaction gives it away. But there is a deeper, quieter layer of change that almost no one ever sees. A layer of edits so small that they pass completely unnoticed by ordinary viewers. A single line of dialogue altered. A pair of hands redrawn. A few seconds trimmed so smoothly that the episode seems whole. These are the changes that happen below the threshold of attention. The kind a person could watch 100 times without ever suspecting that anything had been touched. And SpongeBob, like most long-running shows, is full of them. A familiar surface hiding dozens of tiny adjustments that quietly separate the version people remember from the version that first aired. The unsettling thing about these small edits is what they imply. They mean that the episodes people grew up rewatching, the comfortable, familiar stories they could recite from memory, were in many cases not quite the original. Somewhere along the way, between the first broadcast and the version that settled into endless reruns, small hands reached in and changed things. A word here, a gesture there, and the changed version became the one that most people would ever know. The original, in these cases, did not vanish in a dramatic way. It simply faded, replaced so gently that no one mourned it because no one realized it was gone. A good place to begin is with the way these edits sometimes betray themselves, because the betrayal is what makes them findable at all. When a scene is cut from an episode, the cleanest approach is to edit the sound along with the picture so that the music and the dialogue flow smoothly across the gap as if nothing were missing. But this takes care and effort, and it is not always done. Sometimes a scene is simply snipped out while the soundtrack is left alone, and the result is a small telltale stumble. The music skips. A note that should have continued suddenly jumps ahead. The background score, which was composed to match the original length of the scene, no longer fits the shortened version, and the mismatch is audible to anyone listening closely. These musical stumbles are like footprints left at the scene of an edit, quiet evidence that something used to be there. One early episode carries exactly this kind of evidence, and its story is a small lesson in how standards quietly reshape a show. The episode is a famous one, beloved for how perfectly it captures the misery of trying to do a simple task and finding endless ways to avoid it. The story follows SpongeBob as he tries and fails to write a short essay essay, inventing every possible distraction to put off the work. For years, the version of this episode that aired in certain regions was missing several short moments, and the cuts were noticeable, precisely because the music had not been adjusted to cover them. The most discussed of these missing moments was a brief scene in which SpongeBob looks out his window and sees the other characters enjoying the day, outside with Patrick calling out to him to come join the fun. That scene seems entirely harmless, and that is what makes the reason for its removal so revealing. In the background of the shot, Patrick is shown applying sun lotion to Sandy, the squirrel character, rubbing it onto her back. To an innocent eye, it is nothing, a simple summer image of friends at the beach. But to a cautious reviewer, the gesture apparently read the wrong way, looking for a moment as though Patrick might be doing something more, suggestive with the strap of Sandy's swimwear. The image was not intended to suggest anything of the kind. The animation was simply ambiguous enough that someone somewhere decided it could be misread, and so the entire brief moment was cut from broadcast. The music left to stumble over the gap. A scene was removed not because of what it showed, but because of what it might accidentally appear to show, a tiny act of caution against a misreading that most viewers would never have made on their own. The same episode lost another small moment for a different reason, one rooted in the fear of imitation that runs through so much children's television. In a sequence where SpongeBob imagines his future, the original version briefly included a piece of real, live-action footage of a car crash, dropped into the cartoon for a jarring comic effect. Real footage of a real crash, however brief and however silly its context, is exactly the kind of thing that makes the people responsible for a children's program nervous, and so it too was trimmed away. The episode that most people came to know was therefore missing both of these moments, the misreadable beach gesture and the live-action crash, quietly shortened in ways that left only the faint musical stumbles as proof. The most surprising part of this particular story is its ending, because unlike so many censored moments, these cuts were eventually reversed. Years after they were first removed, missing pieces were quietly restored, slotted back into the episode so that it could once again be seen closer to its original form. This is a rare and gentle outcome. Most small edits stay made, the altered version simply becoming permanent through sheer repetition. But here the pendulum swung back, and the episode that had been quietly trimmed was, just as quietly, made whole again. The restoration announced no more loudly than the original cuts had been. Not every small change is a removal. Some are alterations, where the content stays but is adjusted, and these can be even harder to detect because nothing is missing at all. One early episode contained a line of dialogue that played on a crude double meaning. In the original, SpongeBob declared that there would be no more of a certain kind of mishap, using a word that could be heard two ways, and the line was paired with a physical gag of Patrick driving a nail into his own head. The pairing made the cruder reading obvious. In later versions, the word was changed to a milder, innocent one, removing the double meaning entirely while keeping the scene otherwise intact. A viewer who only ever heard the altered line would never suspect anything had changed. The jokes simply became cleaner, the edge sanded off so smoothly that the original edge was forgotten. A similar change touched another early episode, in which SpongeBob originally made a remark about finding something in his pants, a line whose phrasing carried an unintended suggestiveness. The word was quietly swapped for something more innocent, changing pants to sock, and the faint impropriety vanished. These are tiny edits, single words, but they reveal a constant, careful process happening behind the scenes, a continual listening for any phrase that might land the wrong way with a young audience, and a willingness to reach in and adjust it. The show that aired was, in this sense, always being gently policed, its language smoothed and softened over time, line by line, with almost none of these changes ever drawing public notice. Even physical gestures were not safe from this quiet revision. In one early episode about a sporting competition, there was a brief moment in which SpongeBob and Patrick were shown holding hands, a simple image of two friends connected in a moment of excitement or fear. In a small number of the earliest airings, the hand-holding was present. Then it was reanimated. The characters were redrawn so that instead of holding hands, they were holding each other by the shoulder, a change apparently made to avoid any controversy that the original image might attract. This is a remarkable kind of edit because it required actual new animation, redrawing a moment to replace an innocent gesture with a slightly different innocent gesture. The friendship was the same, the affection was the same, only the specific way it was shown was altered, smoothed into a form less likely to be remarked upon, and the redrawn version became the one that endured. Some of these small edits remain genuine mystery, their reasons never confirmed, only guessed at. In one of the show's earliest and most celebrated episodes, a story about a disastrous pizza delivery, a particular line of Squidward's dialogue was quietly removed from later airing. In the line, Squidward complains about an ache in his tentacles. There is nothing obviously wrong with it, and yet at some point it was cut, and the reason has never been officially stated. The theories that have grown up around it are themselves a small window into how this kind of speculation works. One theory holds that the line was removed because the word for his tentacles, said quickly, could be misheard as a much cruder word, the same kind of accidental impropriety that claimed other line. Another theory has nothing to do with content at all, suggesting that the line was simply trimmed to save a few seconds, part of a broader practice of shortening older episodes slightly to make room for more advertising in modern broadcast. Both theories are plausible. Neither has been confirmed. And so the missing line sits in a small cloud of uncertainty, removed for a reason that may have been about decency, or may have been about money, or may have been about something else entirely, with no one outside the process able to say for sure. That uncertainty points to something important about this entire layer of the show's history, which is how much of it cannot be known with confidence. The world of small SpongeBob edits is crowded with claims, and not all of them are true. Some changes that people swear they remember turn out to be tricks of memory, scenes that were never actually different, recalled wrongly, and then repeated until the false memory feels like fact. Others are genuine, but their reasons are pure speculation. Sorting the real edit from the imagined ones and the confirmed reasons from the guessed ones is difficult work, and honesty requires admitting that much of this layer remains foggy. The well-documented edit, the ones with clear evidence like the musical stumbles or the reanimated hands, can be stated with confidence. Many others can only be described as claims, things that may have happened, reasons that may be true, sitting in the same uncertain territory as the missing pizza delivery line. What unites all of these small changes, the confirmed and the uncertain alike, is their quietness. None of them were announced. There was no notice that a line had been altered, no statement that a gesture had been redrawn, no explanation for a trimmed second of dialogue. The changes were simply made, folded into the show, and allowed to become the new normal through repetition. A child watching the reruns had no way of knowing that the version playing was different from the one their older sibling had seen a few years earlier. The edits were invisible by design, meant to slip beneath notice, and for the most part, they succeeded. Only the dedicated fans, the ones who compared versions and listened for the stumbles and collected the old recordings, ever pieced together the full picture of how much had quietly shifted. There is a particular feeling that comes from learning all of this, a slightly vertiginous sense that something familiar was never quite as fixed as it seemed. The episodes felt permanent. They felt like solid objects, the same every time, reliable in a way that few things in childhood are. And yet they were being adjusted all along, smoothed and softened and trimmed, a word changed here, a gesture redrawn there, a few seconds removed and sometimes much later restored. The show was never a finished frozen thing. It was a living document continually edited in tiny increments by people the audience never saw, according to standards that shifted with the years and concerns that the viewers never knew existed. It is tempting to find this troubling, but there is another way to see it. Every one of these small edits represents someone paying close attention, someone watching the show with the specific worry of how a young child might see it, catching an ambiguous gesture or a misreadable line and deciding to be careful. The caution can seem excessive, especially when it reaches for the most innocent possible explanation of why a scene might be a problem. But it comes from the same place as all the other changes in this story. The simple fact that this is a show made for children and that the people responsible for it carry the quiet burden of guessing what millions of young viewers might absorb, imitate, or misunderstand. The small edits are the visible trace of that burden, the footprints of an endless, invisible process of care and caution, most of it happening far below the level where anyone would ever think to look. The familiar episodes, then, are not quite what they appear. Beneath their comfortable surface lies a record of countless tiny decisions, a word softened, a hand redrawn, a moment trimmed, each one too small to notice and yet real, accumulating over the years into a quiet difference between what the show was and what the show became. And these differences, subtle as they are within a single country, grow far larger the moment the show crosses a border, because the same caution that trimmed a few seconds at home took on entirely different shapes in other parts of the world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So beneath the familiar surface of the show lies a hidden record of tiny edit, words softened and gestures redrawn so quietly that almost no one ever noticed. But those small domestic changes are only the beginning, because the same show took on wildly different shapes as it crossed from one country to the next. That final, scattered story is where this journey comes to its close. Section 10. The same show in different countries. A television show feels like a single thing. There is SpongeBob and there is the show about him. And it seems natural to assume that this show is one fixed object, the same everywhere, watched in identical form by everyone who watches it. But that assumption quietly falls apart the moment the show crosses a border. As SpongeBob traveled around the world, it did not arrive in each country unchanged. It was edited, dubbed, trimmed, and adjusted to fit the rules, the sensitivities, and the fears of each place that aired it. The result is that there is no single SpongeBob at all. There are dozens of versions scattered across the globe, each one slightly different from the other, each one shaped by the particular concerns of the country it landed in. Some of these differences are dramatic enough to remove whole episodes. In the United Kingdom and Australia, one early episode was kept off the air for years, considered too disturbing for children. The episode pairs two short stories. One of them sends Squidward tumbling through a surreal nightmare dimension, a strange and frightening place that torments him and his friends as they try to escape, and censors in those countries judged it simply too scary for the young audience. The other story in the pairing carried its own problems, including a briefly flashed, unsettling image of a cross-eyed figure and a piece of crude wordplay that slipped past the writers of a children's show, but not past the reviewers in those countries. For a long stretch of years, this episode was effectively effectively banned in those places, unavailable to the children who could watch nearly every other installment of the show. The ban was eventually lifted toward the end of the 2000s, and the episode finally rejoined the rest of the series. But for a whole period of time, a piece of the show that was perfectly normal in one country was forbidden in another. Children in those years grew up with a version of the show that simply had a hole in it, an episode their counterparts elsewhere knew well and they had never seen. Other differences come down to the body and to clothing, and they reveal how differently various cultures treat the simple matter of nudity, even cartoon nudity. The show has a recurring habit of putting its characters in moments of exposure played entirely for laugh. A sponge with his pants torn, a character caught without clothing, gags that mean nothing in one culture and a great deal in another. In Indonesia, a country with a large religious population and stricter standards around such imagery, several of these moments were cut or altered. A scene from the very first episode, in which SpongeBob leaps from a diving board and leaves his underwear behind, cheerfully announcing his own nakedness, was removed entirely, the dialogue considered inappropriate. Another episode lost 2 separate scenes in that same country, trimmed quietly to fit local expectations. In some countries, the running gag of SpongeBob's pants ripping was simply not shown at all, and in at least one dubbed version prepared for a different region, the moments of supposed nudity were blurred. A digital smudge placed over a cartoon sponge to protect viewers from an exposure that does not really exist. A gesture that is pure silliness in one place becomes something that must be hidden in another, and the same few seconds of film can be harmless, edited, or erased depending entirely on the map. The most extensive transformation of the show may have happened in Japan, where the dubbed version reportedly differs from the original in a great many small ways. Across numerous episodes, lines were changed, jokes were softened, and moments were trimmed to fit local sensibilities. Suggestive remarks were rewritten into innocent ones. Episode titles were changed for reasons that were never fully explained. Certain instances of characters being hurt were reportedly cut, smoothing away the small cruelties that the original show used for comedy. Even minor musical choices were altered, with a children's song in one episode swapped for entirely different music. Pieces of dialogue that carried a double meaning, or that touched on subject considered too adult, were quietly reworded so that the suggestion disappeared. The cumulative effect is a version of the show that, while still recognizably SpongeBob, has been reshaped throughout, its humor adjusted again and again to match a different culture's idea of what is appropriate for children. A viewer who grew up with that dubbed version, and a viewer who grew up with the original would, in a real sense, have watched 2 related but genuinely different shows, each believing theirs was simply the way SpongeBob had always been. The United Kingdom developed its own particular pattern of edits, some of them rooted in concerns that have nothing to do with content and everything to do with physical safety. British broadcasting carries strict rules about flashing light and rapidly changing images because such images can trigger seizures in some viewers. As a result, scenes throughout the show that involved fast flashing were edited in the UK, slowed down or softened to reduce the risk, a kind of censorship aimed not at the mind but at the body. This practice was applied widely, not only to SpongeBob but to many programs, a blanket caution built into the way the country handled animation. Other British edits followed the now familiar logic of imitable danger. In one musical sequence, a moment showing a character touching a hot grill was replaced with safer footage, out of concern that children might copy the dangerous action. That particular edit was later reversed, and the original restored in more recent years, a small reminder that even these decisions are not permanent and can swing back as attitudes shift. There are also reports of other small UK cuts, including a scene in which Mr. Krabs treats Squidward cruelly by sending him into danger, removed as an inappropriate depiction of how an employee ought to be treated. Beyond these well-documented cases lies a wide and uncertain territory of claims about how the show was treated in various countries, and honesty requires holding these reports more loosely. There are stories of episodes banned in certain nations over their depiction of light shows, and stories of musical segments removed in places said to disapprove of music in cartoons. Some of these reports are difficult to verify, resting on scattered accounts rather than firm record, and they sit in the same uncertain space as so many of the show's other legends, possibly true, possibly exaggerated, possibly tangled with misremembering. What can be said with confidence is the broad pattern, which is solid even where individual details are shaky. Across the world, the show was edited differently in nearly every market it entered, according to rules that varied enormously from one country to the next, and the precise shape of those edits in any given place is often clearer to the fans who lived with them than to any official record. When all of these regional versions are laid side by side, a strange and genuinely interesting question emerges. Which one is the real SpongeBob? The version with the fire intact, or the version where the fire was cut? The version with the frightening Squidward, or the version with the harmless baby, or the version where neither appears at all? The version with the hand holding, or the reanimated version with the shoulder? The version with the underwear gag, or the blurred version, or the version where the scene was removed entirely? Each of these exists. Each of these was watched by real children who grew up believing that the version they saw was simply the show, complete and whole. None of them is more official than the others, in the experience of the people who watched them. The show fractured into countless slightly different shapes, and every one of those shapes became someone's genuine, remembered childhood. A person in one country and a person in another could spend an afternoon insisting to each other that they remembered a scene correctly, and both of them could be right, because both of them had seen a real version of the show, just not the same one. This is the quiet truth that ties together everything in this long journey. From the very beginning, the show was never a single fixed object. It began with a character who had a different name, surviving now only in rescued frames. Its first episode was locked away for years by a borrowed song. Scenes were drawn and cut before anyone saw them, preserved only by the people who made them. A burst of fire aired once and then vanished into fog. A famous fan legend was invented, spread further than any truth, and then winked at by the show itself before being erased. An episode was pulled from the schedule and flickered in and out of existence for years. A single frame was swapped, leaving a broken reaction behind. Countless tiny edits softened the show below the threshold of notice. And finally, the show split into dozens of versions as it crossed the world, each one shaped by a different country's fears. What all of these stories share is a single gentle lesson. The bright, cheerful, seemingly simple cartoon that so many people grew up with was, the entire time, a far more complicated and unstable thing than it ever appeared. Behind the Pineapple House and the Krabby Patties and the relentless optimism sat a constant, invisible machinery of business decisions, legal disputes, content standards, cultural sensitivities, and quiet caution, all of it reaching in over the years to add, remove, change, and reshape what the audience actually saw. The show people remember is not quite the show that was made, and the show that was made is not quite the show that aired, and the show that aired is not quite the same from one country to the next. Layer upon layer of decisions, almost none of them visible to the viewer, stacked up over more than 2 decades until the simple act of asking what really happened in a given scene became a small research project of its own. And yet, through all of it, the thing at the center survived. A marine biology teacher's small comic about tide pools grew into a world so carefully, built so beloved and so alive that people spent years tracking down its lost frames, debating its missing scenes, inventing legends about it, and arguing over which version was real. The very fact that all of this hidden history exists, that so many people cared enough to find it, preserve it, and pick it apart, is the truest measure of how much the show came to mean. A cartoon does not generate this kind of devotion unless it has reached something deep in the people who watched it. Children who grew up with the show became adults who refused to let its smallest pieces disappear, who saved old recordings, compared versions frame by frame, and corrected the false stories with the same care they used to recover the true ones. The lost media and the censored scenes are not flaws in the show's story. They are proof of how much that story mattered, the shadow cast by something genuinely bright, a record of all the quiet decisions that shaped one of the most beloved cartoons the world has ever made. The sponge at the center of it all kept smiling through every cut, every swap, every ban, and every border, and somehow, across all of those versions, he remained unmistakably himself. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.